This is one of many abandoned houses in my neighborhood. The slumlord owner let the property deteriorate until it became unlivable and doesn't want to pay the money to make it livable again. There are thousands of abandoned houses in this city and thousands of homeless people. Despite the urgent social need for houses, these properties don't fulfill a social use. Why not? Because the owners of these commodities are not interested in their use. They are interested in their exchange value, the rent they receive from the property. For decades, they collected rent while the use value of the house deteriorated, and now these houses sit vacant, a testimony to the contradiction between use value and exchange value. This is not a contradiction restricted to housing. Every commodity contains this contradiction because every commodity is produced to be exchanged, not to be used by the producer. We have enough food on the planet to feed everyone, yet millions starve. Why? Because we don't produce food directly for social need. We make food in order to sell it for money. Society has much of the technological ideas it needs to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, yet it isn't acting fast enough to apply these ideas. Why? Because production is not undertaken to directly mediate our relation with the environment. We produce for profit. The exchange of the products of labor in the market is just one of many possible ways that the private labors of billions of individuals can be coordinated. Some people think this is the best possible way to coordinate human productive activity. Marx saw that, despite all the dynamism and technological wizardry of capitalism, there were fundamental social antagonisms at the heart of this means of coordination. That production for market exchange leads to all sorts of unexpected consequences, including gross inequality, exploitation, and crisis. And for Marx, all of these social antagonisms can't be understood until we understand the contradiction within the idea of a commodity itself, the contradiction between use value and exchange value. A commodity has a use. This is its use value. What does use value tell us? It tells us how a commodity satisfies a social need. If we want to feed everybody, we need a certain quantity of food. If we want to build everyone a house, we need a certain quantity of wood and nails. Some use values require no effort to attain: air, sun, gravity. Others require effort to attain. There's a finite limit to the amount of labor that can be devoted to the production of use values. Society must apportion this labor between the production of different use values in some way. As technology changes, the amount of labor required to produce some use values decreases, thus signaling a change in the apportioning of labor. As technology evolves to reshape what human labor is capable of producing, so do our needs and desires evolve. In different societies, this labor is apportioned by different methods. In a market society, it is the buying and selling of the products of labor in the marketplace that serves the purpose of allocating labor between the production of this use value or that use value. This creates a second type of value, unique to market societies: exchange value. Exchange value is the ratio in which one good exchanges for another. Perhaps one book is exchanged for a loaf of bread, or a new car exchanges for 1,000 bottles of whiskey. These ratios are all exchange values. They say a book is worth this much bread, a car is worth this much whiskey. In a developed market society, one commodity eventually emerges as the primary commodity in which all other commodities express their exchange value. That is what money is. For most of the history of capitalism, this commodity has been gold. By comparing the ratio of tomatoes or cars or baseballs to gold, all commodities measure their exchange value in ratios to gold. These two sides of the commodity, its use value and exchange value, form two opposing contradictory poles. Much of the social antagonisms of capitalism are rooted in this tension between use value and exchange value. Of course, most of the time when we look at a commodity, it doesn't seem very antagonistic. This is because the antagonistic social relations behind the commodity are not visible. But when we look at a society organized around commodity exchange, we can see lots of social antagonisms. To understand how these social antagonisms spring from the opposition of use value and exchange value, we will need to take a closer look at both. If I am selling a tomato, this tomato has no use value at all for me. Its use value only exists for the person that buys it. I am only interested in the exchange value, how much money I can get for it. Production in a capitalist society is not production for use, but for exchange. This means that we have no inherent interest in the usefulness of our labor outside of its ability to create exchange value. Now, from a social perspective, it's very important what kind of labor we do. Do we make bombs or flowers, oil or cupcakes? But as individuals, we have no stake in this. We produce in order to make money, to get exchange value. Why do people produce for exchange and not for their own use? Because in a capitalist society, the working class does not own the means of producing their own subsistence. The only way for working people to get the necessities of life is to buy them in the market. And the only way to do this is to sell our labor to a capitalist for a wage. We spend our whole life making a profit for an employer so that we can spend this wage in the market to obtain our daily bread. Our job is not a means toward personal satisfaction. Our job is a means of making money so that we can buy our satisfaction in the market.
Newport tastes fresher, tastes better too. Newport tastes fresher, tastes better too.
Bourgeois subjective value theory talks about a double inequality of exchange. It says that the only reason exchange happens is that two people value the other person's product more than the product they are giving up. Marx actually goes even further than this. He says that to the seller, the commodity has no use value at all. Not only does this bourgeois theory of double inequality of exchange give the mistaken impression that people produce for their own wants and then sell off the surplus in the market, it also imposes the profit-maximizing logic of the capitalist onto the consumer. By claiming that consumers make a subjective profit from exchange, it transposes the real, objective profit of a capitalist who pays his workers one sum of money and sells the products of their labor for a greater sum of money onto a completely intangible and unquantifiable notion of subjective profit. But subjective preferences for commodities can't be measured, divided, added to, or compared in any numerical fashion. By imposing the logic of capital onto consumers, it effectively erases class from the scope of its analysis. One book equals one car. What does that mean? What does it mean to say something is worth so much of something else? Some people think that the usefulness of a commodity can answer this. But uses of things can't be compared. You read books. You drive cars. They are totally unrelated and incomparable uses. Maybe you like books more than cars. Does this mean that books are worth more than cars? What does it mean to say a book is worth so many jars of peanut butter or so many cups of coffee? Clearly, jars of peanut butter or cups of coffee are measuring something. And clearly, any other commodity could be used to measure this something. A book could be worth so many pencils, so many kittens, so many tires. And each of these exchange values would be a different way of measuring the value of the book. But this means that the book has a value independent of the particular commodity that we choose to measure it with. Whether we measure the book's value in beers, beans, or kittens, it stays the same. Yet we can't see this value. We only see the specific exchange ratio of the book as it is exchanged with other commodities. But isn't this what exchange value really is? The comparison of the value of one commodity with the value of another? These exchange values only make sense, only work, because there is something called value that is being measured by them. Exchange value necessarily implies the presence of an underlying value. Marx uses the term intrinsic value. By this, he doesn't mean that value lies buried within the commodity, or that it is magically bestowed upon the commodity, but that it is impossible to compare commodities to each other in the market without a commodity having its own value. But what is this value?